So we've got 6 presenters in the session. There were supposed to be 7, each of whom, or each pairing, was going to have 6 minutes each. But now there are 6 of us, so everybody gets 7 minutes each. This is an executive decision that I just made. Maybe Laura's gonna like kick me out as a result of this, but I'm doing it. We're gonna do it. I thought, I mean, I have an order. Laura, do I have to stick to the order that's there?
You're the chair, so
great.
Yeah,
this is too much power.
Yeah.
The reason that I asked that is because my name was listed first. I'm assuming because I was the chair, I'm going to be presenting on my own, but it feels kind of icky for me to, introduce myself and then to talk for 7 minutes straight. I feel much more comfortable with, allowing my fellow panelists to talk about their stuff first. So I'm basically, what I'm going to do is just go down the list. If everybody's okay with that, I'll tell you right now the order that I have so that you don't have to be on the edge of your seat when somebody's done their 7 minutes wondering if it's going to be you next. So I've got Alan first, then Milan, then Katie, Phil, Linda, and Marco. And then we can end with me. And that way, if I don't do a good job chairing and I don't cut people off at the 7-minute mark, then I'm the one who gets penalized, which I think is very fair. So I'll leave it to each of the presenters to introduce themselves and obviously present their podcast in this lightning session. I'm going to have a timer on, and when you have a minute left, I'm going to put up my hand. This is the method that I'm going to do. So I'm going to mute myself. Without further ado, I will pass it off to Alan.
All right, thank you, Chelsea, very much for having me today. I'm here to talk about the podcast Even More Mashed Up, which I co-host with Patrick Hamilton. And Patrick's actually in the room here too, so he can correct me whenever I get something wrong today, which probably won't be more than a minute or two. So Patrick is my co-host. He's a professor of English here at Misericordia University, and I am a history professor. And we pitch our podcast, Even More Mashed Up, as very broadly 2 professors talking about all things pop culture. And we really do mean to kind of be that ambitiously broad because of our scholarly interests. They kind of lead us to superheroes. We spend a lot of time talking about superheroes, both on the big screen, but like on TV too. We've spent way too much time on the CW network. I mean, that's definitely not something I should admit, but we do. But everything from superheroes to toys to movies, old and new, to what people are binging. We really want the show to kind of be tapped into what people are interested in talking about. And it's probably worth noting that the show is so broad because I would describe the podcast as an accidental podcast. We never set out to do a podcast. We co-taught a class for about a decade here called Race and Graphic Narrative in the Post-War United States. And that class spawned a lot of conversations. And at some point we had a student say to us, you guys ought to do a radio show. And what do we know about radio? Nothing, but we went and did it, and we did a half hour, and we figured out we couldn't do it in a half hour. So we then bumped it to an hour. And eventually it became this podcast. It's a fairly regular podcast during the fall and spring semesters. You can find us about once a week releasing something. In the summer, we tend to get a little looser with the schedule. So our emphasis, we have really 2 emphases, I guess I would say. One is to be as broad and inclusive as we can in the subject matter. And the second is to be as broadly accessible as we can as well. It's so important in the 21st century and the world in which we live that humanists share what we know, not only with other humanists, but as broadly as we can with the public. And so we've designed our show to be accessible in as many ways as we can. Certainly our emphasis is always on making a show that's very conversational and spontaneous. We don't script anything before we sit down in the studio to record. And in fact, we've discovered that our best shows actually result when we don't talk about the topic at hand until we're actually in the studio. So it's as fresh as it possibly can be. We also, we laugh a lot on the show. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Patrick is, despite whatever he's probably posting in the chat that I'm not reading right now, he's actually he's the best colleague and the most fun to work with. And like the opportunity like that I have to once a week sit down and have a conversation with Patrick about some random pop culture topic is the greatest thing in the world. Like in a semester that's full of COVID and pandemic teaching and all the stress that's coming to faculty, but also the students that we're working with, to know that it's kind of like my therapy session, I would say, once a week, where I know I can just go and forget about all the problems and laugh with Patrick. But I think the laughing is really important because one of the things I want to communicate to the public with our podcast is that what we do as humanists, like it's just plain fun. Like we have really great jobs, and I'm a historian because I love being a historian. And if people can see kind of the joy in the work we do and understand the work we do better while they're laughing along with us as we argue and we debate and we talk about things that seem completely nonsensical, it just seems like another way to kind of try and pull people into the show. So typically for Even More Mashed Up, and I'm trying to check the time, Patrick and I will sit down in the studio. The show usually runs about an hour. And then what you get when you listen to the podcast is as lightly edited as a podcast possibly could be. I think more or less like whatever you hear on the podcast is what we created in that hour in the studio. So I think actually I might be done a moment early. So Chelsea, I would be happy to cede my time to somebody else if they would like it. Or if Patrick wants to jump in and start correcting me now, that would be fine too. I should have ceded to Patrick first, but I do really appreciate this opportunity. The idea of the symposium I think is so important, and I hope that it will kind of create synergies that will help us all build better podcasts, but a better network of podcasters as well. So thank you.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. I was gonna like make a joke about how, of course, we were gonna go over time because everybody's a podcaster and loves to talk, but that's excellent. If everybody goes short, then maybe we'll even be able to have a Q&A at the end, like, or leave early. What an idea. Anyway, thank you so much, Alan. And I put a link to the podcast or to your webpage on Podbean in the chat. So next up we have Milan, and Milan, I will also put a link to yours in the chat as well. So go ahead.
Thanks, Chelsea. So I'm setting a timer for myself for 4 minutes because I'm going to try and talk about 2 podcast projects, one that has been running a long time and one that is at the moment an idea, but is going to happen in the year ahead. I'm a PhD student in English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. And since 2016, I've been the co-founder and host of the How to Read podcast. Thank you for putting that in the chat. It began with a quite literary focus because that's my disciplinary background. But over the years, we've moved into a really broad kind of humanities and social sciences range of topics, including why binge reading and binge viewing might be a good thing, how the mind processes images of protests, the history of chronic pain. So really, broadly humanistic. And each episode is 15 minutes. It's me in conversation with a different scholar each time, talking about their area of expertise. And we really target it at listeners with no prior knowledge and no academic training. So accessibility is really important for us. In my role as host, I really like to emphasize, I think of myself as a stand-in for those listeners. And so, even asking the most basic question of, things like, who was Charles Dickens? Or what do you mean by political? Those are things that I think we've developed some really good strategies for actually kind of not presuming prior knowledge in our listeners and having conversations that don't presuppose that. In addition, so there's a team of 4 of us at any one time. Olivia Branscombe, who is another grad student who can be here today because of scheduling, but has been involved in organizing this symposium. Olivia Branscombe is the producer and with her philosopher training, listens in for kind of missing links in the logic of the conversation, terminology that is being used that hasn't been defined, So that's really valuable, that while I'm kind of in the flow of the conversation, she is listening in for kind of stuff that will help us out in the edit later. And then we also have 2 undergrad producers who are on the team for a year at a time, and they're also really valuable as, you know, close to our target listener, someone who's intelligent and interested, but doesn't, you know, isn't themselves an expert. So I think 2 things that I want to say about the podcast that I think are distinctive. Firstly, so each episode is only 15 minutes. So the short format, for us, that's again a kind of accessibility thing, that, you know, it feels approachable in a way that some longer scholarly podcasts might not. But actually that shortness comes at an enormous cost to us in terms of time investment. So it's been interesting hearing about other people's podcasts and their kind of behind the scenes processes during this symposium already. I would say that we collectively as a team spend somewhere between 30 and 40 hours on each 15-minute episode. So that's, you know, a lot of kind of invisible labor behind the scenes that I hope pays off in the kind of the quality of the conversation. But it is, yeah, it's sort of like a very long timeline behind the scenes and then this very short object at the end. And then also to echo some things that Alan was saying, you know, we really value making our guests who are typically scholars, although we've branched out a little bit into some kind of practicing artists, so different kinds of expertise, but typically they're scholars, and making them sound like living, breathing humans. So laughter is really important for us as well. This is going to sound maybe a little kind of sinister and calculating, but we pre-script various jokes before we have the conversation. So the guest hasn't heard the jokes, but we've behind the scenes as a team thought about like ways to try and make the guest laugh. And then, you know, when the opportunity arises, I will deliver some of these jokes and see what reaction we get. And another thing that I think is really valuable is the sound of thinking out loud. That's something that, you know, it doesn't happen in every conversation that we record, but the moments where a guest will kind of respond to something that we've asked or said, and they'll say, you know, I've never thought about it like that before, but now this is making me think, and then they begin to sort of think on the spot. Those for us are really wonderful moments that that we always like to include in the edit, because I think it sort of signals to listeners like, oh, you know, like this isn't just some like inaccessible expert, like you can hear them thinking aloud and you can follow along their thinking as they're doing it. So yeah, those are the things I wanted to say about how to read. And now I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to talk about this forthcoming project, which I'm very excited about, but also a bit daunted. So it's a project that we've given the title Speaking of Spirituality. And the idea is firstly, we're going to record a site-specific podcast, which will be in 3 churches in Harlem. So we're based at Columbia, so Harlem is the area around it. And we're going to be walking around these churches with a guest who is both a theologian and a pastor of one of these churches. And we're going to be talking about the queer and feminist and anti-racist histories of each of these churches, because they have these very rich histories. And then the kind of the innovative part is that, so we want listeners to walk that same route, walk through each of these churches and listen to the conversation while looking at the same things that we were looking at, and then be able to speak back to the guest and to that conversation. So there's going to be a kind of interactive component in which they record their own theological reflections, stories that come to mind, and those then go into a kind of a community archive where people can listen to each other's stories. And also we might try to get a local sound artist to create some audio collages out of these contributions. So yeah, I will stop there, but yeah, really excited to hear about other people's projects too.
Awesome. That was like oh, my timer just went off. Look at that. Amazing. Amazing. Thank you so much, Milan. That was really interesting. And yeah, can't wait for the new one too. Very, very exciting stuff. Did I lower my hand? I did. Okay, good. So next up we have Katie. And Katie, I'm not sure if you have a link to your podcast. If you do, you can drop it in the chat. Otherwise, just tell us where we can find it. And then hand it off to you. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Chelsea. My name's Katie. I'm one of the conference organizers with Milan, Laura, Dan, Kim, who are all here. So anyway, it's been a really great first day, and this has just been really exciting. So thank you all for being here and participating. So yeah, I co-host a podcast called Writing Remix with Dan Dissinger. So Dan, my name's on it, but you're here, so we're just gonna do this together. But yeah, we put the link in. Basically, our podcast is about, it's kind of broad, but anything to do with writing, language, rhetoric, art. So we always have a guest on our episode, and we just kind of have big conversations about, what writing means to them and how they use language. And the central kind of concept for the podcast is the ways that writing is constantly being remixed, or language is being remixed. And so how we're just incorporating different ideas and different sources of information and putting them together in new ways to create, something different and exciting. So I don't know, do you have something to add to that, Dan?
I think I think the main thing is when we went into doing this podcast, like we didn't want it to just be about just writing and rhetoric. Like that could be there's a lot there, but we wanted it to be more about, like Katie said, like language and languaging. Like how does any of our guests use language to communicate messaging and messages, and how is that happening? Some of the episodes that we've done have been like with entrepreneurs. With the last episode we just released was with a comedian, and he was talking about shadow work and everything, which is like that we didn't know where that episode was going to go. So like there's almost like literally almost no plan. Like we kind of just dive into a conversation off the person's bio. So they like tell their story or whatever, and then we kind of move from there. We do a little research, but it's not like heavily researched and not heavily edited. It's really pretty free flowing. And we've, also, have been a podcast that has, pivoted during very specific moments in, that we, during the pandemic, like we decided to pivot the whole show and scrap everything to start talking about what it means to teach during the pandemic, and, very, pivoted during, during the protest after George Floyd, was murdered, and so pivoted then again. And then, so the podcast definitely is not just about like the guests that we have on, lined up, but like also about what it means to communicate and engage what is exactly happening when we are recording as well. So it's been a great journey. I don't know, it's been very unpredictable at the same time. So yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, our style is sort of opposite to Milan's in that we do very light editing, and we'll have our conversations are usually about an hour, sometimes a little bit longer, maybe an hour and a half. And we don't, like Dan was saying, we don't have a lot of planning beforehand. We know a little bit about the guests, but we really just try to let it be as organic a conversation as possible and take our cues from them and kind of see what comes up. And then, yeah, in sort of the bigger sense too, that we're always trying to respond to whatever's happening, like culturally or in society at the moment. So yeah, we just try to keep it as open as possible in that way so that we can be really flexible. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we both enjoyed was like including students from USC and other students that we've had like as guests, and they come on, and those episodes have been so amazing and so engaging. I've just blown away by like kind of how the students came on and just was like, just ripped right into what they wanted to say. And it would, so like, it's kind of really great to see, like, once you provide someone a platform, and we said like, the podcast is yours, like our platform is yours at this moment, and kind of like really seeing like where they take it. It's been really fun.
Yeah, I think that's one of our main goals, is just to give people that opportunity to say what they want to, like give them that chance to share their voice, give them that platform. So when there have been certain moments, like after one of the mass shootings that happened, we put together a panel of all Asian or Asian American women to come and speak on that. And in moments like that, we really try to step back as much as possible. And yeah, it's really about like turning it over to the guests and letting them share their story. Yeah, anything else? So I guess just since we have a couple minutes, we'll just put in a plug for, we each have our another podcast as well that we do on the side. So I have one called Witches in Britches that I do with my friends from college. And we do like feminist readings of books, movies, shows, anything that has to do with witches. So we have one coming out next week on The Craft Legacy, the new movie, like sort of a reboot / sequel to The Craft. So that's really fun. And then Dan, do you want to talk about yours? You're muted.
Yeah, so I do one. Here's a link to Katie's other podcast. So like I do one called The Nostalgia Test, and I do it with my friend in New York. It's we go back and look at things from our childhood, with the movies, music, food, toys, random things. We just did an episode on Mentos commercials from the 90s, and we just kind of like discuss them and say, are they still good? Like we liked it when we were teenagers or whatever. Or is it just nostalgic? And it's just like, hey, it's got that special place in our heart, but it's not really great. Or do we look back and go, no, this was really bad. It was bad then, and it's bad now. I can't ever return to it. And we did something, we watched every Rocky movie, and that totally destroyed us. And we had to take about a month off. But I think like it's been fun to kind of go back and do that and see that. But yeah, that's it.
That's amazing. I love that, in this short presentation, we got a little taste of the podcast because you guys were talking back and forth, which was pretty cool. I think that was very nice. Nice touch. And Dan, put a link out for Nostalgia Test if you have something. Oh, you got it. Awesome. All right. Next up, we've got Phil Ford. So go ahead, Phil, and I'll drop a link in the chat.
Okay, hi, I'm Phil, and I am the co-host of a podcast called Weird Studies. My collaborator on that is J.F. Martel, who is a Canadian filmmaker and writer. And he wrote a wonderful book called Reclaiming Art in the Age of Artifice. And I became aware of this book when it was first published in 2015, got in touch with him, and we became fast friends and began a voluminous correspondence. We discovered we have a huge area of overlap. We were both interested in, above all, in art and philosophy and thinking of art and in various philosophical contexts, but those contexts also include inputs from the Western esoteric tradition, or known less politely as the occult. And in kind of getting this conversation going, we ended up, of course, realizing that the best medium for this, if we wanted to do it publicly, would be a podcast. So the podcast is a series of dialogues between JF and myself, sometimes with guests. We do sometimes have guests. Our most recent one is Connor Habib, who may be known to some of you. But the nature of the podcast is given very much by the collaboration between JF and myself, and particularly the fact that he is what I think of as a free-range intellectual. He's somebody who has a background in he has some background in formal study of philosophy, but he's really just kind of a remarkable independent thinker. And I am professor at Indiana University. So it's an opportunity to have a kind of conversation, or stage a kind of conversation that I think is important to have, which is, academia, like reaching outside of academia, engaging with a wider, a wider intellectual context. The show itself, like what it's about, Weird Studies, that actually came out of a joke that I made because the area studies model in the humanities, we've got human animal studies and sound studies and Cold War studies and so on. And because I'm interested in and write a lot about kind of weird stuff, I joked that my field would be weird studies. Although I also believe that it's a field that couldn't really exist because the weird, among other things, can be understood as a zone of exceptions and remainders and one-off things that don't fit easily within any particular category. And so in systematizing the weird into a studies, you would probably end up just chasing the weird away. But the term sort of caught on, and we now host a bi-weekly show, it's only once every 2 weeks, show probably somewhat in the middle in terms of editing or the amount of editing that goes on. We try to craft these episodes sort of almost as audio essays, except, they're unscripted. We generally are talking about some particular text. So just this morning, we recorded an episode on Hermann Hesse's Glass Bead Game. But sometimes it's a conversation about some concept or some idea. So our next episode we're going to do is on Marshall McLuhan's idea of probes, the probe as a medium of thought. And what else to say about it? It's an enormous amount of work. We have lately we're now making enough money doing it that we're able to hire an assistant, one of my graduate advisees, who helps us with the editing and with aspects of production. So that makes the burden a little lighter, but it's a lot of work. I joke that it's my second job. But I'm sure I don't need to tell anybody in this gathering this, but to me, podcasting is an extremely dynamic, extremely alive medium. I particularly relish the opportunity to get in improvisations. Like the thing that I enjoy in teaching most in a seminar, for example, is the feeling of a collective improvisation where themes and motifs are added in or drop out and then maybe come back. And the conversations that JF and I have are themselves, as I say, we try to edit them into kind of shapely audio essays, but there's a real pleasure in going on a walk together, kind of going on a stroll and developing thoughts in the moment, and ending up very often in a place that neither of us saw coming. So that, in a nutshell, is what we do.
That's awesome. Thank you, Phil. And while you were talking, everyone was sharing not only project websites, but social media handles. So feel free to drop that in the chat too, so that we can follow everyone on social media. That was a very good suggestion from Mary Ellen. So thank you. And Phil was saying that he had a hard stop time of 4 p.m. Eastern, I guess, which would be 5 p.m. my time. And we are well within that, Phil. So if you disappear on us, you'll
understand.
Yeah. Exactly.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. So next we have Linda and Marco. So I will pass it off to Linda and Marco.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm sorry to miss some of the sessions today. I was teaching today, but our podcast is Getting Lit with Linda, and it is a literature podcast. The podcast is essentially a happy marriage between a podcast expert, that would be Marco, and a literary expert, that would be me. I'm a professor of literature. And so in view of COVID, I was trying to figure out a way of reaching out to my students in Canadian and Indigenous literatures. And so I reached out to Marco with his background and experience, and who has a book on the subject. I thought he would be able to help me put together a podcast.
Yeah, and my background is actually in theater and film. I'm an actor, so acting, improvising, performing, essentially speaking and connecting. And podcasting for me is about speaking and connecting. And when my agent wasn't calling, well, I picked up a microphone and I tried to figure out, this new medium, and I became a podcaster. And 5 podcasts later, I decided to write a book because everyone was coming to me to find out how to podcast. I asked Linda to help with the book, and she edited it. And so when Linda reached out to me with this challenge, I thought, well, first, I'm glad she's not asking how to do a true crime podcast because there's so many out there. But secondly, like we embarked on this journey, to make a compelling podcast that shares not only Linda's knowledge in the field of Canadian and Indigenous literature, but also how it connects with her personally. Because as with most things in life, when you make something specific, you make it universal. And therefore, the content of a podcast really has the potential to be far more reaching than just students in an undergrad program. But rather, it can, and in our case has, connected with a far greater audience. And it helps bring our collective stories, our literature, to a broader audience. An audience who can receive it anytime, anywhere, wearing anything they wish to. And it makes this content far more accessible than it has been in the past. So I was able to, as a podcaster, lend my experience in podcasting to Linda, who brought her experience and knowledge. And here are the top things I shared with Linda. One, it's better to leave them wanting more than to go a minute into boredom. The second thing I shared with her was, if you don't have access to a studio, sit in your closet with your clothes. They will absorb the sound, you will do the work, and your listeners will know that neither is happening. 3, don't focus on building an audience. Focus on great content, and your audience will find you. And lastly, I shared a whole bunch of tech and editing practice that I won't bore with you, and most of you probably already know how to deal with Audacity or Audition, whatever you use to edit. But I shared this important tip. Always save your work. And in essence, podcasting is saving Linda's work for everyone out there. Now, this was made easy for me because Linda brought the number one thing anyone, I believe, needs to when they start a podcast, and that's passion. Linda brought her passion for the subject to the microphone, and the response we have received has been, you make it sound easy. And that's how I knew it was working. I'll let Linda delve deeper.
Thanks, Marco. So we came up with this formula. We went back and forth trying to figure out what the podcast shape would assume. And so we came up with a formula so that the episodes are released every 2 weeks. That is about as much work as I can handle. And they're not more than 30 minutes long. And again, it's about the boredom principle. But what I was doing was using some of my classroom material, not giving my lectures away, but essentially condensing them or distilling them. Sometimes I'll also use an interview, but the hardcore work for me is the researching. So I'll research for a little while and then distill what I think will be part of my lecture and put that into the podcast. And sometimes I'll also use an interview. Generally, the tone is meant to be a kind of insightful commentary on a book or an author, and then also suggest how it might apply to daily life. So to extend the experience of literature. And so the podcast, therefore, the content mediates between a kind of scholarly undergraduate class and then the general interest. And so just to add to that, it's not off the cuff. It's not, we actually script them. They're very much scripted or planned. And then I let Marco listen to the episodes after I've done the recording, and then he gives me feedback and direction. And sometimes it means doing more substantial editing thereafter. I think that's it. We might be well under. I'm not sure. Marco, do you want to add anything else?
Yeah, I'll just mention that the book I wrote, since Linda said,
I referenced it.
It was 25 Things I Wish I Knew before I started my podcast. And basically I talked about all the challenges that I had figuring out how to podcast because I didn't know and I wish it was there. So I said, I'm just going to do this for the people who are asking me, how did you get started? What tips do you have? And my podcast is called The Insomnia Project, and it is meant for people like myself who have insomnia and can't find sleep. So I do 26 minutes of mundane conversation to bore you to sleep.
So you know a thing or two about boredom.
Oh, for sure.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you both so much. And put those links both to the book and the podcast in the chat. That would be great. Hopefully we can get a list of these compiled. Yeah, that's fantastic. You both are such good hype people for each other. It's awesome to see. Very cool. all right, I'm going to reset my timer. I'm putting it on for myself also because the rules apply to everybody here. Okay, so you all know me. I'm Chelsea. I'm a university professor. I'm an archaeologist. And when COVID happened, we all knew that we weren't going into the field. I'm an archaeologist, and I should say in the Mediterranean in Greece. So like, that's why I wasn't going in the field. I don't do local archaeology, as like, the world shut down and trying to figure out what to do with that summer. Because, I didn't have a million different other articles that should have been published or anything. And thinking about at that point, what would happen if we went online. And of course we did all go online at the university that I'm at and largely across Canada. But we being me and my 5 co-project founders, it's called Peopling the Past, and it's more than just a podcast. I'm one of the podcast hosts, so that's what I'm going to talk about, but there's also a blog and a video series. We came together and we thought, okay, so we're going to go online. This is happening. What can we do? How can we create some resources to make a more sort of engaged, equitable, and accessible like online learning experience for our students? And completely selfishly, I was teaching Greek art and architecture, and I thought, I'm going to make a podcast for this class. I've heard about people using podcasts to teach and all of the advantages of that, but I'm actually going to create a podcast in lieu of assigning like a textbook or readings, and have my students listen to it and have, like readings and other media accompany these episodes week by week. And so we recorded in the summer of, what is it? I guess it was 2020. Of course, it was 2020. And the first season on Greek art and archaeology had a focus on real people in the ancient world and the real people who study them. So that's kind of our tagline for everything that we do in the project. So we're trying to get new, exciting research out there to students and to a general audience. Really, really no background is required for any of the episodes. We're trying to get this research out there because it's typically being done by people whose work wouldn't appear in like a standard undergraduate textbook, whose work wouldn't really appear in the kinds of things that undergrads are going to be exposed to in class, but who are doing the most exciting kinds of work, who are doing like really groundbreaking social history and, applying critical race theory to the archaeology of the ancient world and like really doing amazing things. And so, our episodes feature 2 hosts. We had my co-host for the first season was Carolyn LaFerriere, and then she went on maternity leave and has a beautiful baby girl. And so Melissa Funky is the host of the second season, which focused on Roman art and archaeology. And we are currently doing our 3rd season, which is on women in the ancient Mediterranean world, like really broadly. So again, it's not like you hear women and you think, okay, so like, like Cleopatra and the Roman empresses, but no, we're focused on like real people and stuff that you wouldn't have heard of before. So our Greek archaeology season, I mean, everything from like talking about the depiction of old age in Greek vases to the experience of sound inside of a cave to how water basically meant power in harnessing power in the ancient world, to how studying animal bones can help us understand ancient climate change. So really niche topics, again, that you wouldn't sort of see in an undergraduate textbook. Roman stuff, we have episodes on children's footwear from Roman Britain and the experience of enslaved women, curses, including some like really gross stuff with like blended up mice and like weird things that the ancients were doing, and that like researchers now are like, I guess this is experimental archaeology, so I guess this means I have to blend a mouse now. Like really weird stuff that makes it for, it's I mean, I learned so much. This is the other great part about this podcast, is that like I'm reading stuff that I normally never would read. And I feel like so in tune with the field in a way that I never have before. And trying to make this like groundbreaking research, like really accessible for anybody without any experience is so fun. It's so fun. And I learned so much every single time. We talked about like what it means to see in the ancient world, and how like ancient people thought that seeing was like actually physically absorbing part of the object. It was like going into you. And like, I didn't know that. That's amazing. It's incredible for so many reasons, right? For our understanding of like what we are and philosophy. And it's some incredible stuff. So that's the podcast. Yeah, as several of you have mentioned, like, holy crap, does it take a lot of time to do a podcast? And like, I would have liked that book recommendation, Marco, before March 2020. That would have been helpful. We're super lucky because the six of us all work at universities. We're in various positions, but that means we have access to a lot of university funding. And so now we have two research assistants to help us produce the podcast. And they're amazing. Lauren Millett and Cassie Palmer, I'll throw their names out there. They're incredible. And Lauren now is interested in going into her master's in public history, specifically because she's had a chance to work on, editing the content. Poor thing has to like listen to 45 minutes of us talking and cut it down to like 25 minutes. And yeah, I just think it's so cool that this is becoming more mainstream and a way for everyone to sort of engage with this, with like little known aspects of all of our very niche fields, right? This is the thing with academia. What we actually study is so narrow, and being able to like broaden that for a larger audience, I think is really cool. So yeah, I have like 45 seconds, but I'm going to stop there because I'm never under time. So I'm gonna do that. Since I'm also chairing, we have like 15 minutes left. I was thinking, I mean, anybody can leave if they want to. If people have questions, feel free to throw up your hands or put it in the chat. Maybe it might be fun if each of the presenters, if you recommended like one episode of your podcast for folks to listen to. I think that would be really cool because I never know what to do when I'm listening to a new show. Like, do you start at the beginning or like do you start in the middle? Because usually the beginning's a little rough. I don't know. So would people like to do that? Maybe we can start from the beginning. Do we want to do that? Or we can actually start with Phil because Phil's gonna have to leave first. Can I put you on the spot, Phil?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So a recommended first episode to listen to?
Yeah, like what are we gonna listen to? What are we gonna listen to? That's weird.
I would recommend an episode called Green Mountains Walking. And the title, it's about walking. And the title comes from the Mountains and Waters Sutra of the medieval Zen philosopher Dogen Zenji. And it's just talking about walking, but as the conversation built, we were thinking of poetry. My partner JF is quoting poetry from Wallace Stevens that kind of came to his mind. Michel de Certeau came up, and his thinking about walking in Manhattan and the two perspectives possible, from either as a what he calls a voyeur or as somebody actually walking on the ground. It was a good conversation that went in some interesting places. It's does the kind of thing that we do. I mean, we have done episodes on straight down the middle occult topics like Aleister Crowley, and we have a whole series on the tarot that we're doing. But actually what we do more often and what we really like to do is to talk about things that seem pretty normal. And I can't think of anything more normal than taking a walk, and try and find the affordances that they have to new kinds of thinking.
That's awesome. Thanks, Phil. Alan, will you give us an episode?
Well, yeah, but I need to apologize first. I don't think Patrick and I realized that we could tag team this, and now it feels like I'm doing all the talking, and I mean, poor Patrick's just sitting there with the thing. So if Patrick would want to recommend one, I would happily, Patrick, step aside and let you recommend one. Oh, there he is.
Yeah, I would say probably of our most recent episodes, I think our one on Falcon and Winter Soldier was a really good episode, particularly given mine and Alan's expertise on race in superhero comics. I think that one was a really insightful episode. So I would probably recommend that one.
What was it called?
Falcon and the Winter Soldier on the Disney Plus series, spun out of the Marvel movies.
Okay. Put that in there.
I will just note real quickly.
Yeah.
I'll just note real quickly that I think Daniel earlier said that you can't talk too much about the CW. So if you dig deep into our 5-year archive, Daniel, you will find some like a ridiculous amount of attention back when
Yeah.
Arrow kind of mattered.
Can't wait.
Thanks.
Amazing. All right, Milan, what do you have for us?
So I'd like to recommend one of the two most recent episodes, like either one of the two most recent. The first is Understanding Chronic Pain with Travis Chiwing-Lau. I'm going to put links to these in the chat in just a second. Understanding Chronic Pain with Travis Chiwing-Lau. That was a particularly special one for me because it made me realize that I've been suffering from chronic pain for as long as I can remember, which I had never really thought of before. And he gave me this 200+ year history of thinking about chronic pain. So that was a really special one. And then the other is The Politics of Chill with Robin James. So this is about a trend towards chill styles of music, but also more broadly kind of like chill and the sort of implicit labor politics behind it. Robin James is a philosopher who I've been following for many years. And so it was a real treat to be able to talk with her. So those are the two I would like to recommend.
Thank you. Katie, I think Katie was next. Katie and Dan, right? Or Daniel.
So we have I think 71 episodes at this point. So we were like, which one? It's really hard. It's really hard to pick.
No pressure.
But I think one that was really special and impactful for us, and that we do send a lot of people to, is episode 13. I think Dan has the link for that. And this was, like he mentioned earlier, in the wake of the George Floyd murder and that really critical moment last summer. We had a special panel come on and talk about their experience as Black Americans, and just super emotional and a really powerful episode. So that's a great one we like to send people to.
Awesome. Cool. Is it in the, oh, it is. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for putting that in there. And then Linda and Marco.
Well, we probably each have one. I'll pick mine, Marco, and then see what you come up with. Maybe the same, but it's actually our third episode, and it's called My Body is a Record, on Madeline Tian's novel, Do Not Say We Have Nothing. And so what I do in this particular episode is I look at epigenetics and an experience that I had in relation to my own body, and I talk about how bodies are historical records, and then track how Madeline Tian does that in her novel.
For me, so I should come clean and tell you that I don't read Canadian literature. Instead, I listen to the podcast that Linda does, and I feel like I've garnered so much knowledge. And I think it's one of the things I love about our podcast, because, when I started podcasting 6 years ago, there weren't a lot of Canadian podcasts out there, let alone any reference to the stories that are within my own country. And so I'm so grateful for this podcast, because I feel like our stories are being told and available to a much larger audience. And we just got an email from someone in Germany who really enjoyed it. But my favorite episode is a more recent episode, which is When the Body Complains by Jane Rule. Her book was called, I believe, Taking My Life. Linda, correct me if I'm wrong. But I learned something really key in that podcast episode about the work of Jane Rule and how pivotal she was to LGBTQ writing in my own country. And I'm sad to say that if it wasn't for the podcast, I wouldn't know how important this author was and how they basically shaped queer literature in my own nation. So that's my favorite episode.
That's awesome. Will you both put the links to those in the chat? Because I realized I was typing everything, but then of course I was like, oh, I guess I have to put one too. And so I was trying to find like a link to my own selfishly. But yes, please put those links down. And I'll put a link to mine also. And just so everybody knows, you can click on the little 3 dots in your chat to save the chat if you don't want to be like frantically copying all of this stuff down, so that you can have this for later, because maybe everybody else knew that, but we teach with Microsoft Teams over here and where I live in Canada, and did not know that was a feature of Zoom. Anyway, yes, mine, we just had our 1-year anniversary of this project, and I specifically did not commit to having a favorite podcast episode, and chose favorite blog posts or videos for that purpose. This is tough. One that I really like is the first episode of season 2, which is the one that I was talking about children's footwear in Roman Britain, and it's called If the Roman Shoe Fits, and it's with a scholar named Elizabeth Green, Beth Green, and she's awesome and hilarious. And she mentions the term winkle picker. So like, is there anything else that you need to know besides that? Like, that's it. No, but it's really cool. And there's nothing, I think, more sort of like universally like connecting than like shoes and footwear, right? Kind of in the same way that Phil was talking about like walking, right? And having that very, like, what a way to connect with these people who lived 2,000 years ago is to look at their shoes. So I'll throw the link to that in there. And that's it. I don't know, it's 4:53, we can leave, we can hang tight, it's 5:53 in some places, 3:53 in others, does anybody have any questions or want to say any last words?
Can I jump in and encourage everyone to come to day 2 of the symposium tomorrow? Many of the people in here are involved in panels and not panels. We deliberately didn't have panels, roundtables and workshops tomorrow. And I wanted to selfishly drop a link to one of the workshops that I'm involved in tomorrow, because many of you were talking about how a podcast felt like a second job and it takes forever. And, how do you manage that? And tomorrow we'll be talking about podcast life balance. But now I will stop talking because I see that there is a question in the chat.
Yeah. Ayani, did you want to unmute? Oh, it's there. Do you want me to read it for you? Yes.
I can read it. That's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
I didn't want to talk over anybody. Let me just throw my video on too. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for a wonderful panel. I just had a really quick question for those of you that are also doing kind of like media, lit related podcasts. How do you handle the expectation of whether your listeners will have read or not read the kinds of things that you're talking about? This is something that myself and my co-host kind of spend a lot of time thinking about. So I just wanted to ask how other folks are handling that question.
I can step in here, and I know Marco can probably help in this particular moment, but I assume that no one has read anything at all. And that, I think, is the best place to start, because it allows me to create a kind of foundation and then build on that. So Marco has not read these books, and so that's why I get him to listen to them to make sure
And I
that
never will.
you will. And so I know that if he doesn't understand, or if there's something that's missing, he'll flag it for me and say, you need to put this in your introduction, or I did an interview recently with Jordan Abel, the Niska poet. And so he said, there's something that you're missing in the interview. You need to put that in your introductory piece, and then I'll do it. So it's really good to get someone who's not read any of the books you're talking about to give it a listen, just to make sure.
And to have a keen sense of what your listeners beyond the scope of people who read might not be aware of. So in the case that Linda was talking about residential schools, and I was like, our international listeners won't understand what that is because they may not have seen the news. So we need to give a definition. That's one of the things I look at when we're doing our podcast, or when I'm listening to what Linda has provided. It's like the broader scope. Will people understand this, and what needs to be defined?
Yeah, I want to add to this. I think it's such a great question that at least everyone who is doing a literature podcast should be asking themselves. I felt like when I began my podcast in 2015, 2016, a lot of the literature podcasts that existed then were very much assuming that we'd all read the same book, and that listeners could just engage as people who had read the book already. How to read does not presuppose any knowledge of the book, or any objects that the guests are talking about, and partly that's about accessibility, but also it's because early on we were kind of thinking about sort of doing a podcast that will involve more close reading as something that literary scholars love to do and can kind of do endlessly, and just realized that the podcast format, we couldn't really make that work because it required holding too many words in your head at one time as a listener. So I think there's the question of like, have people read it, but also sort of what kinds of reading do you do during the podcast? And we've really tried to keep that to a minimum. yeah, that's my bit.
Yeah, and if I could add one thing, if you do want your listeners to read the book that you're going to cover, I would give them 2 weeks head notice saying, like, in 2 weeks' time, we're going to be covering this book. That would afford any listeners who really want to follow along, having read the book, to at least access the book and read it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We do a lot of pop culture stuff. So sometimes it's like, do I want to assume that people haven't watched Bridgerton? But I really appreciate the feedback. Thank you.
Well, it's funny to think about that. When we were doing our art and archaeology seasons, we had kind of the opposite problem in trying to figure out how do we describe like visual things that people can't see because they're listening to a podcast. And like, yeah, we can say, go look at our website later, but like having that sort of like, yeah, really describing everything and assuming just zero prior knowledge. Super interesting. It's 2 minutes too. I think we can call it. Yeah, how's everybody feeling? This was awesome. I think this was wonderful. It was so fantastic to hear from all of you, and I've got a new long listening list with the rest of you, and I've followed some new people on Twitter, which is very exciting too. So thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers. This is a really cool network, and I'm so happy to be involved with this. And thanks to all of you for being here.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.